Hi, I'm Tom Miggett from Tom Miggett Photography. A few episodes ago we talked about the creative aspect of the shutter and we saw how we could freeze time. Well, I also mentioned you guys that with the shutter you could also imply motion into your photography, and this is what we're going to try to achieve today. And I'm at the Musselburgh racetrack where there's a horse race today, and we're going to try to do some panning photography. So what is panning photography? Well, panning photography is about not using such a quick shutter speed, but by taking the shot while panning and carry on, you will see that there will be blur behind your subject while your subject remain sharp, and that will imply some motion into it. Very useful if you're shooting any moving object. So that's what we're going to try to achieve today. It's an overcast day today, and I'm going to go for an ISO of 100, and I'm going to be shooting on the manual mode, simply because I want to choose my aperture, I want to choose my shutter speed. So for today, 100 ISO, and I'm going for a shutter speed of 1/30th of a second. Yes, indeed, 1/30th of a second, not 300. This is pretty slow. I told you it's not about having a quick shutter speed. It's about capturing a sharp subject while moving and giving some blur in the background. So 1/30th of a second, and in order to get a correct exposure with today, we need to have an aperture of about 20. So let's try f20. Yes, the camera metering system tells me that at f20 with a 30th of a second, I should get a correct exposure, providing that the ISO is at 100. There's a few things that you need to do on your camera in order to do panning photography. Although you could do it with all the camera, but it's a bit more complicated. What I'm referring to is about the focusing mechanism. You will need, or it makes it easier, if your camera can autofocus continuously. And there's a mode for this on your camera, and it's either continuous or AI servo. And if you set your camera to AI servo, what it enables you to do is focus on your subject while you have pressed the shutter, and you carry on like this. And when you're ready to take the shot, then you complete the press. And what happens is that as you have your finger halfway through on the shutter button, it basically keeps focusing as your subject is moving along, getting closer to you, so you don't have to refocus at the last second. If you do not have this feature, don't be worried. You can still do it. What you need to do is to figure out where your subject is going to go. So, which is pretty easy for a racetrack because they're all going around, right? So, you know that the horses are going to be coming from here and they're going to pass in front of us and carry on. So you could set your focus on one particular spot, somewhere here, where you know the horse is bound to pass by. So by pre-focusing on this, all you need to do is wait for your horse to pass along. My advice would be, once you set up your focus point, make sure you lock your focus. And then once it's that, then you just go and follow your horse in the viewfinder. Follow it until you reach the point where you wanted to take the picture from. And then you press, and as you press, you carry on panning with your camera. If you don't, what's going to happen is you're going to have a sharp image of a horse, but in fact it's not going to be that sharp because the horse is going to go too fast for the shutter speed. So the panning movement helps you to get a sharp horse while blurring the background. So, the focusing mechanism, either you go for the continuous AI servo mode, and you need to go on spot focusing. Your camera should allow you to take either one dot, one particular spot, or the whole picture, and your camera will figure out what needs to be focused on. Well, do not use that. Specify the spot you want to meter. Like this, you're sure that your subject remains the one in focus. It's actually raining, which is not surprising because, hey, we're in Scotland today. So I just have to wait for the horses now. There's a few races this afternoon. I don't know how long I'm going to have to wait. Anyway, I took a few shots earlier on, and I'm going to carry on taking a few shots. You might not be able to see me as I'm taking the shots, but never mind, we'll still go through the final exposures together afterwards on the computer. Okay guys, so I'm back inside. I've taken so many exposures, and I must confess, a lot of them were rubbish. But that's normal, that was meant to happen. It's a lot of trial and error. And really my tip, before I go any further, my tip to you, if this is the first time, your first attempt to do panning photography, I would recommend you to try against car or bike or running people, but basically anything that goes from one side to the other. But if it goes from one side to the other and up and down, this is getting really difficult. And I initially thought that, well, taking the opportunity of that horse race was a good idea. However, I must admit this was really tricky, because not only the horses go from right to left or left to right, but the jockey, the rider, is going up and down as well. The head of the horse is going up and down as well. So it might appear like a total nightmare if you try to do panning photography. However, we all like a little bit of challenge, don't we? So the first exposure that you see here is basically what I'm trying to show why it's not that great to freeze a moment when there is an action. As you see here, I've been shooting ISO 100 with an aperture of 5, but look at my shutter speed. I went for 500ths of a second, and that's way too much. That will stop a car, and that's really froze the action. And as a result, well, it's neat, but it's frozen. There is no movement. There's nothing. Even the horse, right? It kind of looked fake, like if they were wooden horses and it just like put them like this and the legs don't move, and that's all they are. Everything seems to be really frozen in time, and that's definitely not a great exposure in terms of sharing a feeling or sharing a sensation of speed. So let's see what I got trying to do panning photography against horses. So with the very next one, so here I actually zoomed quite far away, because as you see they were way beyond the bend before the first curve. So what you can see is that the ISO remained the same, ISO 100. My F value, my aperture was 20, because I thought that if I was going under that, below that, it would be actually overexposed. But that was one of my first exposure. Here it looks a little bit pixelized, but let me just zoom out a little bit, because it was a bit too zoomed in. Maybe that's too much. So it's a bit pixelized, but normally it shouldn't be. So what you see here, pretty much all the horses were pretty much at the same level, and because the subject of my exposure was, or were, because in that matter there were like many horses, were very far away from me, the notion of speed appears slower to me. You know, if something is really close to you, it's gonna appear to go extremely faster than it is if it was 10 meters away or 100 meters away or even 200 meters away, like it's the case in this exposure. So they appear to go very slowly for me, which was easy to keep track of them and focusing and shooting continuously. What you can also see is, so they are sharp, pixelized in here, because I really zoomed in, sorry, on my computer screen. But what I hope you notice is the background and the foreground is blurred. And it's not blurred because I play with the aperture. Look at the aperture. The aperture is f20. f20 usually it's a very deep depth of field. You usually don't have this bokeh effect, this blur out in the background and in the foreground when you use f20. f20 is what you would use if you do landscape photography, where you really need a deep depth of field. So here is really the panning movement that
enable us to keep the subjects in focus, sharp, while blurring the background. So not too bad, but then I'll try to take closer shots. So let's carry on. So this one, let me zoom out a little bit. So I kept the f20. Going backward, it was a 30th of a second. So on this one as well, in fact, it's on the other side of the band. So you see the maybe the back white fence. That was where they were initially on the previous picture. You see, so they went around the bend and they just facing me pretty much. In that one, it's just to show you it's not that sharp, right? I'm not going to argue this. It's really not that sharp because it's a very difficult subject to capture. Like I said, the rider is going back and forth, up and down. The horse head is going up and down as well. The legs are moving as well. Everything is moving. However, what you see is you can still feel the speed. The notion, the movement has been injected in that photography, and that's really what I wanted you to say, and the whole process behind it. It might not be a great exposure. I'm not that proud of that exposure, to be honest. I'm not at all. But it's just to as a sample of what I'm trying to demonstrate here. So let's carry on. This, okay. Where are the horses? Well, there's no horses on this one. What I like to do is I'm waiting. So I was waiting for the next race to start, and what I wanted to do was playing with the aperture. You notice before I used f20, and this time I wanted to play with a wider aperture, a smaller aperture value to really maybe extend the blur a little bit too much, really power it. Because as we know, if we widen the aperture, then the depth of field it gets very narrow, and so the background and the foreground would be blurred. So that's what I try to play with here. So before the horses came, I wanted to take a shot and see whether or not I would be overexposed. Not that it really matters in that context, because once again, I'm not trying to do a correct exposure here. I'm just trying to show you what panning photography is and how you can inject motion into photography. So I went with the same ISO because that's the smallest ISO value I could get with. And then f5.6, so quite a wide aperture, not the widest, but with the lens that I have and the zoom I was using, it was quite wide. And then a shutter speed of 1/50th of a second. Here it was 1/30th of a second. So you understand why I had to go with 1/50th of a second, right? It's because if I had kept 1/30th of a second, it would have been much whiter than that, much brighter than that, because it would have been overexposed. I've opened the aperture, I kept the same ISO, opened the aperture, and if I keep the same shutter speed, well, it's going to be overexposed. So I have to compensate and increase my shutter speed. Of course, you could say that between a 30th of a second and a 50th of a second, it's not even a stop. So whereas from f20 to f5.6, well, there's more than a stop. In fact, there is f8, f11, f16, and f22. So almost 4 stops when it comes to the aperture change, but not even 1 stop for the shutter speed. The reason being is I didn't shoot that exposure at the same location. All right, so that's what it is, and you can see on this one it's a bit darker, but I didn't shoot at the same location, so that's why it changes. So this is my sample. This is what I like to do before the real shot, just to make sure that I'm actually quite okay. You can see I did a fake panning without horses, just to see how the blur would appear, and I think I've used something like the white fence as a focus point. So I carry on, and here was the shot that came right after, and they haven't at that point they hadn't reached my right in front of me. They were still on my right when I took that shot. So you see I kept the 1/50th. I kept the aperture at 5.6, and you see the first horse is kind of sharp. Like I said, it's a lot of things are moving. His legs are moving, his head are moving, the jockey, the rider is moving, the cars behind are moving, but you can see the rest is the rest of the picture is blurred out. There's this kind of movement in the photography, and that's what I was aiming at. So moving forward and zooming out a little bit. That's another exposure later on, and I realized that my 5.6 was actually pretty okay with 50th of a second in terms of exposure settings. So I kept that, and as you see, the scene is a little bit blurred, not as blurred as it used to be because it's a bit farther, but still showing some movement in this. So zooming out a little bit. So here's obviously there's much more blur in the background because they're getting closer to me and I'm moving faster, although the shutter speed remained the same, but I'm panning faster, so that's why there's more there's a little bit more blur than before we could distinguish every single tree almost, or the difference of color of the tree leaves, whereas this one, well, it's definitely more blurred. So do I have another one? Yes, I do have another one. So same exposure setting. You can see the really I quite like that shot because the first horse, you see the legs, right? They're not frozen anymore. You see the motion in the leg, especially the one behind it, the gray horse. Look at that. It's like it's the moment where it took off, like it's jumping, right? It's almost a fraction of a second before we could, or after we could have captured the horse with no attachment or no. Without touching the ground at that moment. It's a really interesting shot, I find. Jockey on the first horse is quite sharp. The first part of the horse as well is quite sharp. The head all the way to the beginning of the forelegs. Okay, so no bad at all with this one. In fact, this is my last shot. So I hope you understood what I was trying to show you. Like I said, these are not the best picture that I took, but they do show the concept of this episode, which is another creative aspect of the shutter, and in that particular case, how to imply motion in photography. We will see some other creative aspect. I think the next one will be about the aperture again, because we've done 2 for the shutter, so I think it's time to do a second one for the aperture. And well, it's Monday today. You probably saw the video about the contest, the photography contest with the theme, the creative shutter. So I promised that this video would be out before the end of the contest, so you still have time because it's on Tuesday, late afternoon US time, so you still have some time to submit your picture. Go crazy, try against cars, try against dogs as well, that does it. Anything that moves, really go for it. And yes, try with a 30th of a second, and then you play around with this, and if you want really increase the aperture or really compensate and obtain a correct exposure, don't forget you can change the aperture value. You don't need to go for manual setting. You could try with the TV mode or the S mode for Nikon, which is the shutter priority mode. That's what you can try with, and that should work absolutely fine. So this is it for today. So don't forget, guys, if you've got any question, any comment, any topic suggestion for future episode, don't forget the email address, asktmp@gmail.com. And until then, this is Tom Migot saying, if you like it, well, capture it.